I was given the assignment tonight of giving a talk, no more than half an hour, on the history of folk music. Now, it was a slightly larger topic than I think I could deal with in that period of time. I'm not going to get into the definition of folk music. I know that a lot of people say it is the music that is learned through a folkloric process rather than through formal education. It's not the things that we learn from the printed page or from songbooks. And yet, most of the folk music I know, I learned not through a folkloric process. I learned it from songbooks or printed sheet music, or even more frequently from recorded music. Nevertheless, I'm going to break down this huge topic into just one tiny slice, and what I would like to look at is the development of the folk music scene in New York City from a period of time that began around 1930 and ended 1961 with two events that happened around the same time, the very same week. One of them was the so-called Beatnik riot in Washington Square Park, when the city tried to tell people they did not have the right to sing in the park. And the other was Bob Dylan making his first appearance at Gerde's Folk City. They both happened the same week in April of 1961. But I'm going to go back a little bit earlier. Greenwich Village has been known as a scene of Bohemia going back to the late 19th century, going from there into the first 2 decades of the 20th century. A lot has been written why this happened. I have some views of my own. Once the location of Greenwich Village was such that it touched the very richest people in New York City at the northern end. There was no question about it. The lower end of Fifth Avenue is where it was at if you had money. The southern end of Greenwich Village extended into an area that was the northernmost range of Little Italy and was largely an immigrant community. The western part of Greenwich Village, which had a lot of townhouses and a lot of the early apartment buildings, was pretty much a middle-class neighborhood, and middle class had a different meaning in the late 19th and early 20th century. It did not mean well-paid workers, because there were very few well-paid workers. What it meant were, for the most part, independent professionals and business owners who were above the point of being marginal, who had a little money to spend and were able to afford one of the townhouses or one of the apartments. To the east was real hardcore poverty. Going east, once you went to the other side of where Cooper Union is now, it was largely a German community, an immigrant community. After, do you know about the Steamboat Slocum disaster early in the 20th century? Yes. After that happened, the German community on what's now called the East Village basically moved uptown to the Upper East Side to the 90s. It's now called Yorkville. And were replaced by immigrants, people who left Russia. A lot of them were Ukrainian, a lot of them were Russian, some of them were Polish, because Poland was not an independent country until 1918. And they settled in what we now call the East Village. So you had this mixture of rich and poor. You also had some institutions that just were ripe for lending themselves to a bohemia. And they included NYU, which has been here since 1833. Originally it was within New York City, but was outside the settled part of New York City. And the settled part of New York City moved north. You had the Hotel Albert, which was the first of several residential hotels, where people who were artists, writers, people in the performing arts could find a place to live. You had the Washington Square with the arch going up in 1889. Judson Memorial Church, founded 1893, the first building, we're in it right now, before they built the church around the corner. What else? Provincetown Playhouse, Little Red Schoolhouse, Cherry Lane Theater, a lot of institutions that made this area right for Bohemia. Laura has a picture of, and she'll pass it around, of the Golden Swan Cafe that was on the corner of West 4th Street and 6th Avenue. And it was a scene where the rich and the poor and the in-between and the artists and the leaders of industry could all rub shoulders and get plastered until Prohibition came and make Google eyes at one another, and people with money could go slumming and people without money could try to find a sugar daddy. Anyway, let's jump ahead to the 1930s. By this time, Greenwich Village already is a scene of Bohemia, and a new social infrastructure comes about. A fellow named Max Gordon opens up a nightclub called the Village Vanguard in 1935. Village Vanguard, we know primarily as a jazz club, but interestingly enough, it not only had jazz, it also had folk music. It also had poetry readings. It was a rather experimental place, and people who knew a little guitar, there weren't that many banjo players, this was pre-Pete days, found employment there, including some people who we'll talk about in a moment, including Burl Ives and Josh White. And at the same time, actually a little bit later, 1938, a fellow named Barney Josephson opened up a place called Cafe Society. Cafe Society was mostly a jazz club, but it also had some folk music, particularly blues musicians. And the thing about Cafe Society, it was the first truly interracial nightclub in New York City. The clubs in Harlem, like the Cotton Club, might have black entertainers, but they were strictly segregated. Most of their clientele on weekends were white, and they did not allow black patrons. Some of the places would have nights for black patrons, Monday or a Tuesday night, but when it came to Friday and Saturday, that was strictly for white folks. Cafe Society on Sheridan Square broke the mold, and it was considered scandalous because not only were there racially integrated acts. Josh White appeared with Libby Holman. I'm not sure if anyone knows who Libby Holman was. She was a torch singer from the wonderful blues singer, white woman. And Josh White, who was a black blues guitarist and singer. They performed together, but they had interracial audiences. And this was just about unheard of. There was also a second Cafe Society uptown in the Times Square area. But the one that was really hopping was the one down in the Village. And that's when, as I say, folk music began to develop. Some of the people I'm going to talk about in the 1930s. Aunt Molly Jackson comes to New York City from Kentucky to raise money for striking miners. And then she discovers she likes it here. Anyway, if she went back to Kentucky, there's a good chance she would be killed. So she settles here. Later on, her brother Jim Garland comes, her half-brother Jim Garland comes. Josh White, blues player, 17 years old, 1931, comes to New York City. I forget where from the South he came, but 1933, a student from Illinois, Southern Illinois, coming to New York City to study at Juilliard School of Music. He later became Big Daddy on Broadway. You know who I'm talking about? Burl Ives. 1934, Earl Robinson, musical director of Elizabeth Irwin High School, which is the high school component, grades 9, 10, 11, 12, to Little Red Schoolhouse. Little Red Schoolhouse was a progressive school started in the 1920s by the New York City Board of Education. By the 1930s, the Board of Education says, we don't want to fund this place anymore. It's run by Reds and commies and socialists. So the parents themselves decided to rescue the school. Earl Robinson was a member of the Communist Party USA. And for some reason, around 1934, the Communist Party discovered folk music. There was a theater arts division of the Communist Party before then. They were very much interested in producing theater music. There was cabaret, there was left-wing cabaret. But the idea of traditional folk music, you know, those hillbillies and stuff, they have culture. Suddenly in the 1930s, the Communist Party awakens to that. Who else came to New York? Huddie Ledbetter, 1935. You have a picture of Huddie Ledbetter, better known as Lead Belly, former prisoner. This is really weird, but Life magazine does a featured piece on him, and this is a direct quote from the headlines of Life magazine in 1937. They say, "Bad nigger makes good minstrel." That was a Life magazine headline for a story. It was actually a pretty good story about Lead Belly, but someone who wrote that headline, it's very, very, very strange, but that's what happened. Lead Belly came to New York City with his mentor and his protector, John Lomax, who was one of the great folklorists and was the director of the folk music division of the Library of Congress, and was a collector of folk songs going back to the early 1900s when he was a student at the University of Texas. But John Lomax and Lead Belly had a falling out. Some of it was over their roles. Lead Belly felt that John Lomax was taking too much of the credit and maybe money that rightfully belonged to Lead Belly. I've heard Anna Lomax, who is John Lomax's granddaughter, defend her grandfather and saying that it was a symbiotic relationship. Yeah, I'll get to that in just a minute. But what happened is that nevertheless they had a falling out. John Lomax went back to Washington, D.C. after presenting Lead Belly at some of the nightclubs in New York. And Lead Belly got an apartment on East 10th Street, the East Village, and got a job teaching at the Little Red Schoolhouse. And as I said, he wasn't the only person there. The musical director, as I said, was Earl Robinson. Then, the person who is like at the center of everything for the next God knows how many years, Pete Seeger, comes to New York City, to the Village, in 1938. The story behind Pete Seeger is he was going to be a music student at Harvard. His father was an academic musician, composer. So was his mom, Constance Seeger. His father, Charles Seeger. His father loved folk music, but thought it was something for the peasants. You know, that's what the peasants do when they go out in the field. They sing folk music. The idea that it's something for educated people was something new, but in 1936, Charles takes his son Pete to a folk festival in North Carolina, and they hear a fellow named Baskin Lamar Lunsford sing, "I wish I was a mole in the ground. I wish I was a mole in the ground. If I was a mole in the ground, I would root this mountain down. I wish I was a mole in the ground." And Lunsford accompanied himself on a 5-string banjo, an instrument that Pete had never seen. He had seen the jazz banjo, the 4-string kind. Pete fell in love with the banjo. He goes away to Harvard, and he spends just about all his time with folk music and with left-wing politics. His grades suffer, and after 2 years, he's failing anyhow, drops out. Where does he come? He comes to New York City. Who does he meet? Well, all the people I mentioned before, but he also meets John Lomax's son, Alan Lomax, who splits his time between Washington and New York. Daddy got him a job at the Library of Congress. That's good. But he also realized that where the action was New York City. And Alan Lomax became one of the folkies. Another pair of folkies were 2 blues musicians who team up in 1942, but they came to New York around 1938 or 39. Brownie McGee and Sonny Terry. And now I'm bringing you up to the close of the 30s. It's around 1940, 1941. Someone comes from, makes his way across the country from California, and that is Woody Guthrie. Comes into New York City in February of 1941, meets Alan Lomax and Lead Belly and Pete Seeger and Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee. Meets some other people like Sis Cunningham, who was from Oklahoma in the same way that Woody was. And Woody becomes an immediate sensation. And he takes songs like the one I just did, I Wish I Was a Mole in the Ground, and he makes them into political songs like The Freeing of Political Prisoner Tom Mooney after 22 years in jail. Mr. Tom Mooney is free. Mr. Tom Mooney is free. He just got his pardon from that old jailhouse warden, Governor Colbert Olson's decree. And Pete realizes something that he never knew you could do. Pete came from this academic background, and to him, what he heard Mommy and Daddy say is it is not up to you to mess with the tradition. Maybe if you're from the Mississippi Delta or from the Appalachian Mountains, you can, but you're a Harvard boy that went to prep school. And you better take those songs and play them note for note, word for word, the way you heard them. If you heard Bascom and Lamar Lunsford in North Carolina do it a certain way, that's the way it's supposed to be done. And Woody Guthrie said to Pete, you want to change the words? Go ahead. You want to change the tune a little bit to fit your voice? Or you want to transpose it to banjo? Just go right ahead and do it. It's okay. There's no one saying you can stop. So, into the 1940s. World War II intervenes, but right before they do, right before it does, Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie join with several other people, Sis Cunningham among them, to form a group called the Almanac Singers. Almanac Singers only exist for a little over a year, 1941 to 42.
Sis Cunningham.
Yes, I mentioned Sis Cunningham. Friend of mine. But what happened is that the Almanac Singers, a lot of their songs, a lot of their politics were aligned with the Communist Party at the time. But in any case, the war came and they went off in different directions. Sis Cunningham moved to Detroit and got a job in the war production factory. Pete Seeger was drafted into the Army and was assigned to entertain soldiers rather than fight. Woody Guthrie joined the U.S. Merchant Marine and was sailing in the Atlantic and got torpedoed a few times and survived, of course. And so the Almanac Singers come to an end after World War II, new generation of people. After World War II, you had still the old folkies who were there from the 30s, but in come some new people, people who were born too late, in some cases, to be in World War II. When they were very young, they were in World War II. And they also find their way to New York. Oscar Brand was from Canada, and his family had moved to Brooklyn, so he was kind of half of a New Yorker. He did serve in the Army, got interested in American folk music, and somehow he landed a job with NYC Radio in 1946. And the show actually was December of 1945, his first broadcast. The show was on the air until 2016. The longest running radio show in the history of radio. It was called Folk Song Festival on WNYC Radio. Pete Seeger got together with a few other people and formed an organization to produce political songs called People's Songs, and a booking agency called People's Artists, and a record company called People's Records. And this lasted for about 4 years. Their idea was that they would provide songs for progressive movements like unions, and they found out within a few years the unions didn't want them anymore. Unions would say, ugh, these are communists, get them out of here. And so People's Songs folded, but their song bulletin continued. Instead of being People's Songs, it became a magazine called Sing Out that lasted to 2014. That's the first issue of Sing Out there. On the cover was something called the Hammer Song, also known as If I Had a Hammer. Meanwhile, there was more of this economic infrastructure that could support folk musicians. Folkways Records was founded by Bo Ash in 1948 to record folk music. Gene Ritchie graduated from the University of Kentucky with a degree in social work. That's a picture of Gene Ritchie, also a friend of mine, with Woody Guthrie. She got a job in New York City at the Henry Street Settlement, teaching music to their children. And she became one of the grand old ladies of the folk music scene in New York all the way up to her death a few years ago. 1948, Pete Seeger and a few other people, the picture of Fred Hellerman, Lee Hayes, who sometimes performed with the Almanac Singers, and Ronnie Gilbert formed the Weavers. And they are together from 1948 with some change of personnel to 1964. However, fairly early, after a few years, Pete decides he wants to go in a different musical direction. They were at the top of the pop charts. They were able to take a few songs like Saint It Sainter and So Long It's Been Good to Know You, Irene Goodnight. That was one of Leadbelly's songs. These were #1 on the pop charts. And then suddenly someone discovered, oh my God, that Seeger guy, he's a communist. Which he was at one time. And suddenly the bookings disappeared. But that didn't stop them. The Weavers were able to play sometimes at county fairs, sometimes at colleges. And they were able, because of their manager, Harold Leventhal, to rent Carnegie Hall once a year. And then in 1980, they had a reunion, 2 nights actually, at Carnegie Hall. And so they were around with some changes of personnel until '64, but Pete Seeger was gone by 1958. So, setting the background for what will become the folk music explosion, a few other people who you should know about. Charity Bailey. Charity Bailey was a music teacher who graduated from the Rhode Island School of Education, State University, State Teachers College, went to Juilliard School of Music, tried to get a job in Providence, Rhode Island as a music teacher, and the board would not hire her because they said it is not right that a Negro should be teaching white children. And since we're not a segregated school system, we don't have any Negro schools, sorry, we can't hire her. They actually said that. Charity Bailey came to New York City and got a job. She lived here in the village. She got an apartment in the village. She got a job teaching at the Little Red Schoolhouse and stayed there for 12 years. She later on taught at a fancy private school called the Heathcote School. But for 2 years, 1954 to 1956, she had a song on television. I loved that. I used to watch it when I was a child, called Sing a Song. She would sit there at her piano, and she'd have a group of children, an interracial group of children, from the Little Red Schoolhouse, by the way, and she'd have them sing songs. She'd teach them songs. She gave them simple instruments to play, mostly rhythm instruments, and you would sing along at home. It sold songbooks. Charity Bailey was definitely part of the folk scene, even though by being one of the people who went on to television, she was a little bit apart from the rest of it, but she was here in the village and people knew her. Some other things. I talked about all these people who came to New York. How about native New Yorkers? Several of them. Roger Sprung. Roger Sprung was one of the great bluegrass musicians. 1950, he went down south to the Appalachian Mountains to study bluegrass music at the Source. Learned it very well. At one point, he's at a festival in 1952, Union Grove, North Carolina, and none other than Lunsford himself, the one who first taught Pete Seeger how to play banjo, says, we have this Jewish fella here from New York City who says he can do our music. Let's see if he really can. That was the introduction. Sprung, by the way, could do the music. And he died only a year or two ago.
Who was that? What was the name?
Roger Sprung.
Okay.
His older brother George is the one who got the permit to use Washington Square, the park, around the fountain on Sunday afternoons from 2 to 6 for folk singing. He actually got the permit from the Parks Department, and that permit would later be revoked. Someone else from New York, native New Yorker Tom Paley, a math teacher. He got interested in really old-time country music, mostly listening to records. He became a real master of the banjo and the fiddle. And what he did is he organized a group called the New Lost City Ramblers. Unlike the Weavers and unlike the Kingston Trio and unlike the Brothers Four and the groups that followed, like Peter, Paul, and Mary, he didn't clean up the music. He didn't make it palatable for urban ears. He said, let's do the music the way it originally was recorded. And in that sense, the New Lost City Ramblers were recreationists, is what they're generally called, as opposed to sauce singers. But New Yorker, another New Yorker from Brooklyn, son of a doctor, Jack Elliott, whose name Elliott Adipose. Age 15, he decided to run away from home and join a circus. Join a rodeo. There's only one rodeo in the East. His parents found and brought him home. 3 years later, when he was 18, he said goodbye for good and became a character, Rambling Jack Elliott, he called himself. When people asked him where he came from, he just said, out west. One of the things about Roger Sprung, Tom Paley, and Rambling Jack Elliott, all three of them befriended Woody Guthrie, who was beginning to get sick from Huntington's disease, and they would they would go out to Beach Haven in Brooklyn, or later on to Howard Beach in Queens, where Woody Guthrie lived, and they would perform with him. I had one time that I was at a folk festival doing a workshop on Woody Guthrie songs, and I was playing a song called Sally, Don't You Grieve. And I'm playing it, and Roger Sprung, who's sitting in the audience, says to me, where did you learn that song from? And I said, from the Woody Guthrie songbook. And he said, let me show you how Woody and I used to do it. And he wasn't putting me down, by the way. He showed me a lot. I mean, he was a good friend and a mentor. But all three of those people, Roger Sprung and Tom Paley, Rambling Jack Elliott, became Woody Guthrie's sidekick. A role that earlier Cisco Houston had, but Cisco died in 1961 from stomach cancer. Another native of New York, very important, probably one of the most important, Dave Van Rock. You have a picture of Dave Van Rock? Started playing Dixieland jazz. He had a group that he said, our group wanted to play jazz in the worst way, and we did. As a jazz musician, it was a simple transition to become a blues man, to blues and ragtime, incredibly good finger-style guitarist. And also someone who died before his time. He lived for many years, right here on McDougal Street. It's known as the mayor of McDougal Street. A couple of other things. Harry Smith was kind of a polymath who was into a little bit of everything. He put together an anthology of American folk music from old 78 records that he had collected. That anthology was released in 1952, and while it never reached the top of the charts, it was something that a lot of people bought and used as a reference. You have a picture of the anthology there somewhere? No, we'll get to it. Some other people, some other things. Folklore Center. Israel Young opens something called the Folklore Center on McDougal Street. 1957 becomes a hangout for the folk musicians in the village. Also, it's a place you could get records, you could get magazines about folk music, you could get songbooks, you could buy guitar strings there. Bob Dylan used to come by and buy his guitar strings there. You could buy harmonicas in any key. You wanted an E-flat harmonica? Izzy Young had it at the Folklore Center. And also, I should mention, around the same time, a sandal maker named Alan Block had a store right there also. And Alan Block's store was also a hangout for folk musicians in the mid and late 50s. 1959, a young soldier stationed at Fort Dix from Oklahoma comes into the village whenever he gets a furlough, whenever he gets a pass, and he hangs out, and his name is Tom Paxton. After he's discharged from the Army, he gives himself 1 year to make it as a folk singer. And the way he does it is he writes a song every day. At the end of a year, he has 365 songs, and he himself says about 345 of them are crap. The other ones include Can't Help Wonder Where I'm Bound, and Last Thing on My Mind, and Bottle of Wine, and, well, I think you know the early Tom Paxton songs. Gaslight Cafe. John Mitchell opens up this cafe on McDougal Street between 3rd and Bleecker. 1958, it becomes a hangout for folk musicians. He's the first person who consistently books only folk musicians. Other places would have folk musicians, but also have jazz and have poetry, and maybe a cabaret act, maybe a comedy act. Gaslight, Gaslight remains in business until 1971. Right across the street the next year, 1959, the Cafe War opens. Now, they're still there, but I don't know if they've had folk music in a long time. They do have a bigger, more eclectic program. Okay, we're getting near the end. 1960, a bar on West 4th Street, 10 West 4th Street. Izzy Young from the Folklore Center convinces them, I have to wrap it up now?
No.
Oh, okay. Izzy Young convinces them that what you should be doing is booking folk music. This is the hottest thing that's going to be around. This place is going to be going wild. And I'll just tell you who to book. And they do that. And they get crowds in. And the bar was called Gertie's. They changed their name to Gertie's Folk City. After 10 years, they had to move because the landlord tore the building down. So they moved from West 4th to West 3rd. But the original Folklore Center was the place, the Mecca, the place to come to. They're coming to New York City. Then, 1959, George Whedon, who's producing a very successful jazz festival, Newport, Rhode Island, every summer, decides, let's try something a little bit different. Let's have a folk music festival. And ask Pete Seeger to help him, give him some advice as to what should be done, who we should have. And that becomes the Newport Folk Festival that still exists. There were periods of time that it didn't. And Toshi certainly was involved in that also. Was she on the board of directors? She may have been.
She was very influential.
She was very influential. Okay. But the Newport Folk Festival, for about 10 years, even though it's not in the village, was a place where the up-and-coming folk acts, you went to hear them, as well as the established ones. So they would have the Oscar Brands, and they would have the Dave Van Rocks there, and they would have the Gene Ritchies, but they'd also have some of these young people. For example, in 1959, one of the people they booked, Bob Gibson, brings a young woman along with him who would become a sensation in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and that is Joan Baez. And she steals the show. I mean, Bob Gibson, do people remember him? Well, I do, but... anyway, we're getting towards the end here. So, very important. 1930s, the beginning of the social and economic infrastructure that could support the folk music community. Where does it happen? It happens in a place that's already the center of Bohemia for New York City, and one of the centers of Bohemia for the country. So that's Greenwich Village, of course. 1930s, the Josh Whites and the Burl Ives make their way to New York City, as do the Pete Seegers. And 1940s come, flourishing folk music scene takes a little bit of a hiatus. They're still around, but it's you have the blackouts. You can't have the type of nightlife that you had before the war. As soon as the war ends, added to that nucleus that was already there are the new people like Oscar Brand and people who are native to New York City, like Tom Paley, and Dave Van Ron. And then you have a new flock of people coming in, Phil Oakes being one of them, Tom Paxton being one of them, some lesser-known people like Mark Spolstra, some people like Fred Neal, Karen Dalton, come in the late 50s, and then suddenly, 1961, a young man makes his way to New York City looking to meet Woody Guthrie, and that is Bob Zimmerman. Robert Zimmerman calls himself Bob Dylan. And in April of 1961, Game On, he is booked to perform at Gertie's Folk City. That very same week, that Sunday, before Bob Dylan's performance, New York City decides to revoke the permit that was issued in 1944 to have singing in the park. And what happened is there's a big protest organized at the Folklore Center by none other than Izzy Young, who owns the Folklore Center, and he asked people to do what now we would call a sing-in. Bring your guitars, bring your auto harps, bring your banjos, and we're going to just keep on singing. And the police make several dozen arrests, and the New York Daily Mirror, bless their soul, gives it publicity far beyond anyone could imagine by running the headline, 3,000 beatniks riot in the village. Well, they weren't beatniks, they didn't riot. I don't know if there were 3,000 protesters there. There were probably a couple of hundred and maybe several thousand people who were onlookers. But that's another story for another day, the folk music scene from the 1960s to the present, and I will conclude it there.